He was traded like livestock for a plot of land. But what he discovered behind the widow's silence changed the course of both their lives. The courthouse smelled of ink and dust, its windows streaked with grime that let the sunlight through in broken strips across the floor. Eli Weston stood stiff near the desk, his boots scuffing against the warped boards, while the clerk cleared his throat and read the words in a flat voice. He was only 17, though the lines around his mouth made him look older, the kind of lines that came from hard work and little laughter. His father stood beside him, hat in hand, eyes darting to the older woman across the room. Margaret Hale sat upright, her black dress plain but pressed, her hair pinned tight beneath a dark bonnet. Her face bore the marks of years and of storms weathered, not cruel but unyielding, and she watched the paper with a steady gaze that did not flicker once. Eli listened, though the words barely sank in, as if they belonged to someone else. Marriage, union, contract, all laid out like cattle brands and fence lines, nothing soft about it. His father coughed, shifting from one foot to the other, his voice thick as he muttered agreement at each pause. When the clerk asked if all parties consented, Eli's father gripped his shoulder with a heavy hand and answered yes for him, his tone sharp, final. Eli wanted to speak, to argue, to at least ask why, but his tongue sat heavy in his mouth, locked by the shame that burned through him hotter than the desert sun outside. Margaret did not smile, not once, and she did not look at Eli until the papers were signed. Then, slowly, she turned her eyes to him, and for the first time he felt the weight of what was being done. She was nearly twice his mother's age when she had died, her hair streaked with silver, her cheeks hollowed by years of work or grief. There was no cruelty in her eyes, only something guarded, like a door bolted shut. He wondered if she hated this as much as he did, if she too felt bound like a horse tied too short to a post. The townsfolk had gathered just beyond the door, whispering, the sound of their murmurs seeping through the thin walls. Eli caught fragments. Poor boy, desperate family, foolish bargain, each word slicing deeper than the one before. He clenched his fists and stared at the floorboards, trying not to see himself as they saw him, a boy sold like livestock for the price of land. When it was over, the clerk gathered the papers with a tired sigh, blotting the ink and stacking them neat. His father let out a breath of relief, shoulders sagging, as if he had carried a boulder and at last set it down. Margaret rose, her movements precise, and said nothing as she walked toward the door. Eli followed, because what else could he do? His chest tight, his pride broken, his life shifted into something he had never chosen. The sunlight outside struck him full in the face, too bright, too hot, and as the whispers followed them down the street, Eli Weston felt smaller than he had ever felt before, a boy trapped in a man's bargain with no way out. The church was small and plain, its steeple leaning slightly as if tired of holding itself up against the prairie winds. Inside, the wooden pews creaked with the weight of neighbors who had come not out of kindness, but curiosity, their eyes sharp as needles, waiting to see the odd sight of a boy and a woman old enough to be his mother, bound together in the name of God and law. Eli Weston stood stiff at the front, his hands clammy, his collar too tight, the air in his chest thin. The preacher shuffled papers with little care, his voice flat when he finally began the words that were supposed to be holy, but sounded instead like a business deal struck between strangers. Margaret Hale stood beside Eli, her veil falling low enough to shadow her features, but not enough to hide the weary lines etched around her mouth. Her back was straight, her gloved hand steady, her presence one of control that Eli could not match, no matter how much he tried. He was 17 and felt it with every glance from the crowd, the whispers rising like a hiss around him. He heard them, poor boy, bought and bound. What a shame, what a fool. His face burned hot, though he tried not to flinch. When the preacher asked them to join hands, Margaret reached out without hesitation. her fingers cool and firm as they wrapped around his. She did not smile, did not tremble, did not give him anything soft to hold on to. Her grip was steady, practical, and Eli felt the gulf between them, like the space of years stretched too wide to cross. He looked at her profile, the curve of her jaw beneath the veil, the streaks of silver in the dark of her hair, and wondered what had brought her here, to this moment, where she chose him out of all men. He wanted to ask, but the words would never come. The preacher droned on, his tone without life, speaking of vows and duty, speaking of obedience and faith. Yet the words passed through Eli, as if they were smoke. He thought of his father standing outside the church doors, already dreaming of land kept safe from debt, already certain this was worth the price. Eli thought of freedom, of riding out past the hills and never looking back. But the weight of Margaret's hand in his made clear there was no escape now. When it came time for the final words, the preacher looked at each of them in turn, his eyes tired, as though even he pitied them. Margaret gave a small nod, her voice calm and sure when she spoke her assent. Eli forced the word yes past his lips, though it felt like ash in his throat, and with that, it was done. No bells rang, no flowers were thrown, no laughter or joy marked the moment. Only whispers filled the air, some mocking, some pitying, the sound of neighbors who would carry this story for years to come. Margaret lifted her veil as they stepped outside into the glaring sun, her eyes meeting his for the first time without shadow between them. There was no cruelty in her gaze, only something guarded and tired, as though she carried a past too heavy for him to name. Eli looked back at her, young and uncertain, and realized that whatever lay ahead would not be a marriage in the way most imagined it. It would be something harder, something stranger, a bond forged not by choice but by necessity. And with that knowledge heavy in his chest, Eli Weston walked down the church steps beside Margaret Hale, each step echoing like a nail hammered into the shape of his new life. The trail to Margaret's ranch stretched long and empty, the land rolling out in shades of brown and gold, beneath a sky too wide for comfort. Eli rode beside her in silence, his mind churning with questions he did not dare ask. She kept her gaze forward, reins held firm, her back straight, as if she were carved from the same hard wood as the saddle she sat on. Hours passed without a word between them, only the steady clop of hooves and the dry whistle of wind moving across the open fields. By the time the house came into view, the sun was already dipping low, throwing long shadows across the ground. The ranch stood solid against the horizon, larger than Eli expected, though its paint was faded and the barn sagged a little at the corners. It was a place built for more hands than it had, too big for one woman, too lonely for comfort. He followed her through the gate, his stomach heavy with unease, watching how she dismounted without hesitation, tying her horse as though this was the only life she had ever known. He slid down from his saddle slower, still uncertain where he belonged. Inside, the house smelled of soap and cedar. The floors were swept, the shelves neat, every dish and piece of cloth placed with care. Yet the rooms felt hollow, filled with echoes rather than warmth. The parlor had chairs but no laughter. The kitchen had pots and pans but no scent of bread or stew. The walls carried silence thicker than dust. Eli felt it pressing down on him, a loneliness too loud to ignore. Margaret led him down the narrow hall and opened a door to a small room. A bed waited there, plain and made with a quilt that looked old but kept clean. A single dresser stood in the corner, its surface bare except for a lamp. She set his small satchel on the bed and said in a tone more businesslike than gentle, "This will be yours. Supper is in an hour." Then she turned and left without waiting for a reply. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the quilt, his chest heavy with the weight of what had been decided for him. He felt less like a husband and more like a hired hand brought in to help keep the place running. No vows or rings had changed that. No words spoken in the church had made him feel part of this house. He belonged here no more than a stranger passing through, yet here he would stay. At supper, they sat across from each other at a wide wooden table. The meal was simple: beans and bread, nothing more. Margaret ate with quiet efficiency, her eyes rarely lifting from her plate. Eli tried to think of something to say, but the silence between them felt like stone. When the dishes were cleared, she gave a brief nod and rose, her voice calm but distant as she said, "Good night." He watched her walk away, her footsteps fading down the hall, and knew with a sinking heart that this place was not a home, not yet, only a house of echoes where he was bound by duty rather than love. The nights on the ranch stretched long and restless. The house that seemed so quiet in the daylight grew heavier after dark. The silence, filled with sounds that made Eli's skin prickle. He would lie in his narrow bed, staring at the beams above, and hear her footsteps moving slow across the hall. Sometimes they paused by the window, sometimes by the parlor, but they never rested. The floor creaked, the boards carrying her weight like sighs in the dark, and then came the whispers. At first he thought she prayed, but the more he listened, the clearer it became. She was speaking names, one after another, low and broken, like calling to ghosts that never answered. Eli strained to catch the words, but most slipped away into the stillness. A few lingered, the syllables sharp, the sound of them carrying grief that made his stomach twist. He turned on his side and pressed the pillow over his ears, trying to shut it out, but the whispers slid through, haunting him as surely as they haunted her. One evening he rose before dawn, unable to bear lying still any longer, and found her standing in the parlor. A single lamp lit the room, casting her in dim gold, and her gaze was fixed on a portrait that hung above the mantel. The painting showed a man in uniform, his jaw strong, his eyes steady, his shoulders squared with pride. The brushstrokes were careful, the frame polished, though dust lined the edges. Margaret's face, half shadowed by the lamplight, looked softer than Eli had ever seen it, but her eyes carried a sadness that cut deep. He stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. At last he asked, "Who is he?" His voice broke the silence, thin and uncertain, and for a moment he wished he had held his tongue. Margaret turned, her lips pressed tight, and the look she gave him made his chest tighten. She did not answer. Instead, she drew the veil of her composure back around her and blew out the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. She brushed past him without a word, her silence colder than anger, her presence leaving a chill in its wake. Eli lingered in the parlor, staring at the portrait barely visible in the moonlight. The man's eyes seemed to follow him, steady and unyielding, as if judging him from beyond the grave. He thought of Margaret's whispers, the names she spoke, and he wondered which belonged to this man. Husband, brother, son? He could not tell, only that the loss of him had carved a wound in her that time had never closed. Back in his room, Eli lay awake, troubled by questions he could not voice. Why had she chosen him if her heart was still chained to another? Why bind a boy to a life already haunted by ghosts? He thought of her silence at the church, her steady hand at the table, her guarded eyes that gave nothing away, and he felt smaller than ever. She carried grief he did not understand, grief he was not sure he could touch, and yet he lived beneath the same roof, bound to her by law, if not by choice. The wind rattled the shutters, and the coyotes howled out on the prairie, but louder than both was the sound of her footsteps drifting once more across the hall. Each creak a reminder that he was not alone, yet never less at home, and as he closed his eyes he wondered not for the first time why she wanted him at all. The morning broke pale and cold, the kind of light that made the ranch look lonelier than usual. Eli had been awake since before dawn, lying in his bed, with thoughts gnawing at him like wolves. He could not stand another night of listening to footsteps in the hall, another day of silence at the table, another hour of feeling like a hired hand instead of a husband. He told himself he was still young, that he had years ahead to find a life of his own, not this half-existence bound to a woman who gave him nothing but walls. By the time the sun rose over the hills, he had made his choice. He went to the barn, his breath clouding in the chill, and pulled down the saddle from its peg. The leather creaked as he lifted it, heavier than he remembered, but he slung it over his arm with determination. His horse nickered softly, shifting its weight as if sensing his intent. Eli brushed a hand over the animal's neck, his jaw tight. He would ride out and not look back, let the land fall to ruin, let his father curse him, let Margaret keep her ghosts. Anything was better than staying. He had just set the saddle across the horse's back when a voice cut through the stillness, sharp, clear, and stronger than he had ever heard it. "If you leave, boy, you'll throw away the only chance at land you'll ever own." The words froze him where he stood. He turned and saw Margaret in the barn doorway, her face stern, her eyes blazing in a way that startled him. She had always been quiet, steady, but now she looked carved from stone, unyielding and fierce. Eli swallowed. His pride stung. "I'm not your servant," he muttered, gripping the reins. "I never asked for this." Her boots struck the dirt floor as she stepped closer, her presence filling the barn. "And I never asked for you," she said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "But here we are. You think I wanted to marry a boy half my age. You think I enjoy listening to you sulk in silence, waiting for you to run. I made this bargain because I needed someone who could carry this place forward. Someone with hands that could work the soil and build a life." Her words landed heavy, harsher than any slap, and yet there was something fierce beneath them, something that made his chest tighten. He had never seen her eyes so alive, so full of fire. She wasn't mocking him or dismissing him. She was daring him to stay, daring him to stand tall instead of running. Eli's grip on the reins loosened. He felt the heat rise to his face, shame burning hot in his chest. For the first time, he saw her not as a cold widow keeping him at arm's length, but as a woman who had lost much and still fought to hold on to what little she had left. Margaret's voice softened, though the steel never left it. "You walk away now, and you'll be nothing but a drifter with empty hands. You stay, and someday this land will be yours, and you'll have something no man can take from you." The barn fell quiet, except for the sound of the horse shifting its weight. Eli stood there, torn between the wild urge to ride out into the horizon and the heavy truth in her words. Slowly, he lifted the saddle from the horse's back and set it down again, his hands trembling with the weight of his choice. Margaret watched him, her expression unreadable, but in her eyes he caught a glimmer of respect, or perhaps relief. That morning, Eli learned she was not just a shadow of grief, but a woman who carried fire deep within her, and though he did not yet understand her, he felt for the first time that leaving might cost him more than staying. The days settled into a rhythm that felt less like prison and more like work shared between two people. Eli rose before the sun, his boots heavy with dew, and found Margaret already awake, her hair pinned tight, her sleeves rolled. She moved with purpose, showing him where the fence posts had rotted, where wires sagged, where the wind had torn shingles from the roof. She didn't waste words, only gave him tools and showed him how to use them. At first he resented her sharp tone, the way she corrected his grip or told him to brace the post deeper. But slowly he began to see the sense in her ways. The fences grew straighter, the wire taut, the land looking less broken. One afternoon he found her standing near the corral, her hand resting on the worn rail, her eyes fixed on the horses inside. She had not ridden in years, she admitted quietly, her voice lower than usual, as if confessing something that embarrassed her. Eli saddled one of the gentler mares and held the reins out to her. She shook her head at first, saying her body was too old, that she was content to watch. But Eli stepped closer, placing the reins into her hands, his voice firmer than he expected when he said, "Try." She studied him for a moment, as though measuring the boy she had married against the man he might become. and then she mounted. Her back was stiff, her balance uncertain, but when the horse moved at a slow walk and the wind caught her face, something softened in her expression. For the first time, Eli saw her not as a woman weighed down by grief, but as someone remembering a part of herself she thought was gone. Their suppers were still quiet, the scrape of forks against plates filling the silence. But it was not the same kind of silence that haunted the house before. It felt steadier, like two people who didn't need to fill the air with words. Eli began to notice small things, how she always gave him the larger portion without remark, how she patched his shirt without being asked, how she paused to listen when he spoke about the land, even if she didn't reply. One evening, he tried cooking for her. The beans burned at the bottom of the pot, the bread fell flat, and the meat was so tough he nearly broke a tooth on it. He expected her to sit in silence as always, perhaps push the plate away. But when he cursed under his breath at the bread crumbling apart, he heard a sound he had never heard from her before. A low, sudden laugh, quick and sharp, but real. Eli froze, staring at her, not sure he had imagined it. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders trembling as the laugh escaped again. He felt heat rise in his chest, not from shame but from something warmer, something lighter. The sound of her laughter filled the kitchen like sunlight spilling into a dark room, chasing out shadows that had long lingered there. Margaret shook her head, still smiling faintly, and said in a voice softer than he thought possible, "You should leave the cooking to me." It was a small thing, a moment so brief it could have been missed. But to Eli, it was the first crack in the wall between them, the first sign that beneath all her silence and sternness there lived something human, something warm, something that might one day meet him halfway across the distance that had kept them apart. The day was dry and still, the kind of heat that pressed the air flat against the earth. Eli was mending a gate near the corral when he heard the steady rhythm of hooves in the distance. He looked up, expecting a passing rider, maybe a trader or one of the neighbors from 3 valleys over, but the figure that crested the ridge carried an edge to him that made Eli's stomach tighten. The man sat tall in the saddle, shoulders broad, his face scarred down one cheek like a mark left by a knife or bullet. His clothes were dusty, worn hard by travel, and the way he rode spoke of a man too used to trouble to fear it. Margaret had been sweeping the porch, her bonnet shading her face. When she heard the hoofbeats, she froze, the broom slipping from her fingers to the boards with a hollow clatter. Eli saw her stiffen, her hand gripping the porch rail so tight her knuckles turned white. The rider slowed as he reached the yard, pulling his horse to a stop with a sharp tug on the reins. Dust swirled around him, curling like smoke in the sun, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then the man tipped his hat back, and his eyes settled on Margaret. "Maggie," he said, his voice rough with years and whiskey. "Long time." The sound of that name, spoken like it belonged to another woman, made Eli's skin prickle. He glanced at Margaret, waiting for her to answer, but she said nothing. Her face was pale beneath the brim of her bonnet, her lips pressed into a thin line. The stranger smiled, though it was not friendly. He leaned forward in his saddle, his scar catching the light, and went on. "Thought you could bury it, Maggie. But debts don't stay in the ground." Eli stepped closer to the porch, his hand brushing against the rail, ready though he didn't know what for. Margaret's shoulders trembled once, the faintest shiver, before she drew herself upright. Her voice was low when she finally spoke, "Leave." The single word carried weight, but not enough to hide the fear laced in it. The man chuckled. A dry sound like boots grinding on gravel. "You think telling me makes it so? You know better than that." He glanced at Eli then, his eyes narrowing, taking in the boy with a look that made Eli want to straighten his back and stand taller. "And who's this?" he asked. "The new keeper of your ghosts." Eli felt the heat rise in his chest, but said nothing. He looked at Margaret, searching her face for answers she would not give. She only gripped the rail tighter, her silence a wall between them. The man spat into the dust, pulled his reins, and said over his shoulder, as he turned his horse, "Debts never stay buried." Then he rode off slow, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the air long after his figure vanished over the ridge. Eli stood still, his heart beating hard. He looked at Margaret again, but she had turned away, her back straight, her hands trembling against the porch rail. In that moment he knew her silence was not emptiness but weight, heavy and dangerous, filled with secrets she had never spoken. He thought of his own shame, of the whispers in town, of being bound into a life not of his choosing, and he realized with a cold clarity that whatever burden he carried was small compared to the shadows that followed her. The night after the stranger came, the house felt tighter than its walls could hold. Eli lay awake in his small room, staring at the ceiling beams, replaying the scarred man's words until they tangled with the sound of Margaret's silence. He could hear her moving in the parlor, not pacing as she sometimes did but sitting still, the boards groaning faintly under her weight. At last he rose, pulling on his boots, and stepped down the hall. She sat in the rocker near the hearth, though no fire burned. Her hands were clasped together in her lap, her face pale in the lantern glow. When she looked up, her eyes carried a weariness that went deeper than the years between them. Eli stood there, shifting his weight, unsure if he should speak, but she broke the silence first. "You ought to know," she said quietly. "I never meant to tell it, but now it won't stay buried." Eli eased onto the chair opposite her, his stomach tight. She drew in a slow breath and began. "Years ago, before this place, before she wore black for longer than she cared to count, she had been married to a man named Caleb Hale. Caleb was no farmer, no rancher, no honest hand. He rode with a gang that lived by the gun, men who robbed stagecoaches and trains, who left smoke and blood in their wake. She was young then, younger than she should have been, and she believed him when he said the money would buy them a better life. Her voice faltered as she went on, but she forced the words out. Caleb was killed in a shootout with the law, bullets cutting him down in a canyon. She buried him with her own hands and swore she'd leave that life behind. The gang scattered, but not all of them fell. Some believed she had hidden gold Caleb never had the chance to spend. They rode off swearing they'd come back for her, and over the years the threats turned into whispers, and the whispers into shadows at her door. Eli listened, his heart pounding. He wanted to tell her she was lying, that she was no widow of an outlaw, but he could see the truth written in her face, in the way her hands trembled when she spoke the name Caleb. The boy inside him felt fear, sharp and cold, the kind that came from knowing danger was closer than he had ever imagined. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred, something strange he did not expect. He looked at her, at the lines around her eyes, at the strength it must have taken to carry this weight alone, and he felt a loyalty grow inside him, raw and uncertain but real. Margaret fell silent then, her story spent, her eyes fixed on the dark window as though expecting the scarred rider to return at any moment. Eli sat still, his throat tight, the world he thought he knew turning to dust around him. He should have hated her for binding him to her secrets, for dragging him into the shadow of outlaws and guns, but instead he found himself leaning forward, his voice steady, though low. "Whatever they think you have, I'll stand with you." Her gaze shifted to him, startled, as if she had not expected any answer at all. For the first time she looked at him not as a boy traded into her keeping, but as someone who might choose to stay. The night split open with gunfire. Eli woke to the crack of shots tearing through the stillness, the window glass rattling in its frame. Horses screamed in the yard, hooves pounding against the dirt, and men's voices rang out, rough and eager. His heart lurched, fear burning hot in his chest. But before he could move, Margaret was already at his door, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "They're here," she said, and thrust a rifle into his hands. Eli had held a rifle before, but never like this, never with his life hanging on the aim of his hands. His fingers shook as he followed her down the hall, the thunder of gunfire shaking the walls. The front window shattered, shards flying across the room, and Margaret dropped to one knee, her movement quick and practiced. She lifted her own rifle, steady as a rock, and fired through the broken glass. One of the raiders cried out, a shadow tumbling from his horse. Eli stared, stunned by the calm in her face, the sure way she loaded the next round. He had never seen her like this, fierce and alive. Her silence burned away by the fire of survival. She shouted for him to cover the back, and he stumbled through the kitchen, his breath ragged, forcing his body to obey. He crouched near the back door, raised the rifle, and fired at the figure moving through the moonlight. The shot rang wild, but the raider ducked back, startled. Eli's ears rang, his shoulder ached from the kick, but something hard settled in him. He would not run, not now. The gang pressed close, their bullets biting into the walls, splinters flying. Smoke from gunpowder filled the rooms, choking and bitter. Margaret moved with a steady rhythm, fire, reload, fire, her voice sharp as she called to him when to shoot, when to hold. Eli followed her lead, clumsy but willing, each shot less shaky than the one before. He saw a man fall near the well, another curse, and retreat toward the corral. The night roared around them, but inside the house it was just the two of them, side by side, bound by the same danger. At one point, the door burst open, a raider lunging in with a pistol raised. Eli froze, the world narrowing to the dark muzzle aimed at him. Before he could draw breath, Margaret fired, the raider dropping heavy across the threshold. She didn't flinch, didn't falter, only stepped forward and kicked the pistol from his hand. Her face was set, her jaw tight, but her aim never wavered. The fight stretched on until the gang, bloodied and broken, pulled back into the dark. Their curses faded with the thunder of retreating hooves, leaving only silence and the acrid sting of smoke. Eli lowered his rifle, his arms trembling, his chest heaving with each breath. Margaret stood near the window, the barrel of her rifle still warm, her hair fallen loose around her face. For a long moment they looked at each other, and in that look was something raw, something deeper than the vows spoken in the church. They had stood together against fire and death, and neither had broken. The walls still bore scars of the bullets, the floor carried blood that would not soon wash away. But Eli felt something new in the air, something that bound them tighter than law or duty. He was no longer just a boy in her house, and she was no longer just a widow with ghosts. They were two souls tempered in smoke and blood, tied together by the fire in the canyon night. The night after the fight was heavy with silence, the kind that comes after blood has been spilled and danger driven back. The yard still smelled of gunpowder, the barn door hung splintered, and the porch carried dark stains where one of the raiders had fallen. Eli sat by the fire inside, his hands still aching from holding the rifle, his body sore with exhaustion, but his mind too restless to let him sleep. Across from him, Margaret tended the flames with a steady hand, her face lit in flickers of orange and gold. She looked worn but unbroken, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes carrying something deeper than fear. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire popped and cracked, the sound filling the space where words should have been. Eli wanted to thank her for saving him, wanted to tell her how he had never seen anyone fight like she had, but the words stayed caught in his throat. It was Margaret who broke the silence, her voice low, rough, as though she had been holding it back for years. "I never wanted this," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Not you. Not any boy bound to me." Eli's stomach tightened, shame washing through him. He lowered his eyes, staring at his hands, the skin raw from the recoil of the rifle. He thought she meant he was nothing but a burden, that she regretted the bargain that had tied them together. But then she spoke again, and her words cut deeper than he expected. "I chose you because you reminded me of him. My son." Eli looked up, startled, and found her eyes glistening in the firelight. "He was 9 when the fever took him," she whispered, her voice trembling, though her hands stayed steady on the iron poker. "Strong as an ox one day, burning like a coal the next. I held him through the night, praying for the fever to break. But by morning he was gone. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and the silence that followed was sharper than any cry. Eli sat frozen, the weight of her sorrow pressing against him. He had never heard her speak of family, never guessed she carried such a wound. Margaret drew in a breath, slow and ragged, and went on. When I saw you standing there in the courthouse, I thought of him. Your eyes, the way you held your shoulders, even the stubborn set of your jaw. It was like seeing a shadow of what I lost. That is why I agreed. Not for love, not for need, but because I was weak enough to want a piece of him back. Her words struck him harder than any bullet. For the first time, Eli saw her not as the cold widow who had shut him out, not as the stern woman who barked orders and held her silence like a shield, but as a mother broken by grief, a woman shaped by loss. He felt his anger soften, replaced by something gentler, a weight in his chest that was not pity, but understanding. He reached across the space between them, his hand trembling as it touched hers. She did not pull away. For a moment they sat like that, firelight dancing across their faces, two souls, bound not by choice, but by the sorrow they carried. Eli whispered softly, I am not him, but I am here. Margaret's eyes closed, a single tear slipping down her cheek, and she nodded. That small gesture, more fragile than any vow, was enough to change the air between them. The days that followed carried a different weight. Not lighter exactly, but changed. Eli no longer rose each morning, feeling trapped by the walls of the ranch, or by the silence of the woman who owned it. Instead, he rose with purpose, pulling on his boots, with the thought that the work was not hers alone, not something forced upon him, but something he wanted to shoulder beside her. He repaired the barn where bullets had torn the wood. He patched the fence line with steadier hands. And when the sun set, he found himself looking forward to supper, where Margaret's presence no longer felt like a burden, but a tether. Margaret softened in ways that were small but unmistakable. She no longer kept her distance at the table, no longer filled the silence with nothing but the scrape of utensils. One evening, as Eli told a story about his father's stubborn mule that refused to plow unless bribed with apples, she laughed. Not the quick burst that had surprised him before, but a steady laugh that warmed the room and lingered like music. Eli found himself laughing too, and for the first time, the house did not echo with emptiness but with something close to life. They began to share more than chores. In the evenings, when the work was done and the land grew quiet, they sat on the porch as the sky bled into stars. Margaret spoke of her childhood on the plains, of summers when the grass grew tall enough to hide a rider, of winters that froze the wells solid. Her voice carried a wistfulness Eli had never heard, and he listened with rapt attention, realizing she had held a world inside her that she had long kept locked away. In turn, he spoke of dreams he had buried, of how he once wanted to ride north and see the great mountains, of how he thought himself destined for something bigger than fence posts and dust. Margaret listened, her eyes soft in the lantern light, and for once she did not correct him or remind him of duty. She only listened. One night, after a long day of mending cattle pens, they sat across from each other at the table. The fire crackled low, their plates pushed aside, and as Margaret reached for a cup, her hand brushed his. Neither moved at first, the touch so simple, yet so startling. Eli's breath caught in his chest, and he looked at her, his eyes searching. She did not pull away. Her fingers lingered against his, warm and steady, and in that moment the air shifted. It was not duty that bound them, not debt or bargain, but something unspoken that sparked between their hands. Margaret's gaze held his, her mouth trembling as if caught between words and silence. Eli felt the boy in him fade, replaced by something steadier, something that wanted to choose rather than be chosen for. He tightened his fingers slightly around hers, and she let him. No vows were spoken, no preacher's voice declared it so, but in that quiet moment, their marriage was reforged, not by law or loss, but by choice. Spring came with rains that softened the earth and filled the creek, and Eli felt the land breathe again beneath his boots. The ranch, once hollow and quiet as a graveyard, stirred with new life. Calves stumbled on shaky legs in the pasture. Wildflowers spread in bright patches along the fence line, and the air carried the scent of grass instead of dust. He worked from dawn until the stars came out, his shirt damp with sweat, his muscles aching, yet he no longer counted the hours as loss. Each post he drove, each gate he mended, each calf he roped, felt like another stone laid in a foundation that could not be taken from him. Margaret moved through the days with the same steady rhythm, but now her silence was not cold. She spoke more, asked his thoughts on the herds, listened when he gave them. She laughed now and then, low and warm, her laughter folding into the house, the way sunlight folds into shadow. At night, they sat together on the porch, the boards worn smooth beneath their boots, and watched the sky fade from gold to violet to black. The stillness between them no longer pressed heavy, but settled comfortable, like an old quilt across tired shoulders. The townsfolk who once whispered now spoke softer when they saw them. Some nodded in greeting, some even tipped their hats with respect. The story of the raid had traveled, of how the widow and the boy fought off a gang under the moonlight, and though tongues still wagged about the strangeness of their pairing, the edge of mockery had dulled. More than one man muttered that Eli Weston had proved himself, that the ranch was standing stronger than before. Margaret carried herself straighter, her chin higher, not to challenge, but to claim the life she had fought to hold. Eli no longer thought of the day in the courthouse as the day his life ended. He thought of it as the day it began, though it took months of fire and sorrow to understand it. He had been a boy then, silent and ashamed, dragged into a bargain he never wanted. Now he felt himself grown, not in years alone, but in spirit. He had chosen to stay, chosen to fight beside her, chosen to build rather than run, and in choosing, he found freedom. Margaret was no longer the widow haunted by whispers in the night. She was his partner, her strength not hidden but shared, her fire no longer smothered by grief. She became the anchor that steadied him, the hand that reached across the table and lingered, the voice that told him without words that he was no longer alone. As summer rolled into fall, the ranch glowed with the hum of life. The fences stood firm, the barns filled with hay, the air alive with the sound of cattle and the whisper of wind through fields of wildflowers. And when Eli looked at Margaret, when he felt her hand slip into his beneath the stars, he knew no town, no bargain, no shadow of the past could ever undo what they had forged. What they had built was not bound by chains, but by choice, and it was theirs, a home no one could ever take. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.